What if I told you that less than 100 years ago, a man seriously proposed building a wall across the Strait of Gibraltar, cutting off the Atlantic Ocean, lowering the Mediterranean Sea by hundreds of feet, and creating an entirely new continent between Europe and Africa? This was not a fantasy story. This was not an alternate history map made for the internet. This was a real plan. A German architect named Herman Sörgel believed Europe could save itself by doing one impossible thing: dam the Mediterranean, drain part of the sea, generate endless electricity, create new land, and fuse Europe and Africa into one giant supercontinent. He called it Atlantropa, and if it had ever been built, the world map would look completely different. This is the story of one of the most insane megaprojects ever imagined: Atlantropa. In the 1920s, Europe was broken. World War I had ended, but the continent was still in chaos. Germany was humiliated. Economies were unstable. Millions were dead. Empires had collapsed. People were poor, angry, unemployed, and terrified that another war was coming. And in that broken world, some people started thinking on a massive scale. This was the age of megaproject dreams. The Panama Canal had already shown that humans could cut through continents. Giant dams were becoming symbols of progress. Electricity was becoming the lifeblood of modern civilization. And Herman Sörgel looked at all of this and thought Europe's leaders were thinking too small. To him, Europe did not need another treaty. It did not need another border. It did not need another political speech. It needed a project so large that nations would be forced to cooperate for generations. Instead of fighting each other, they would build together. And the center of his plan was the Mediterranean Sea. The Mediterranean is almost completely enclosed. Its main connection to the Atlantic Ocean is the Strait of Gibraltar, the narrow gap between Spain and Morocco. At its narrowest point, this gap is only about 8 miles wide. Sörgel looked at that narrow strip of water and saw the key to reshaping the planet. His plan was simple to explain, but almost impossible to build. First, construct a massive hydroelectric dam across Gibraltar. Then build more dams around the Mediterranean, including near the Suez Canal and between Sicily and Tunisia. Once the Atlantic was blocked, the Mediterranean would no longer refill the way it does today. The hot sun would keep evaporating water. Year after year, the sea level would drop. Not by a little, by up to 200 meters, over 650 feet. Ancient port cities would suddenly be stranded far from the coast. Coastlines would move. Islands would connect to the mainland. New land would rise out of the sea. Italy would grow. Greece would change shape. The Adriatic Sea would shrink. And Europe and Africa would become physically closer than ever before. At Gibraltar, the difference between the Atlantic Ocean and the lowered Mediterranean would create a massive waterfall effect. Water would rush through turbines, and those turbines would generate an unbelievable amount of electricity. Sörgel imagined the dam as the greatest power station on Earth, a machine at the edge of the world, turning the ocean itself into energy. To him, this was not destruction. This was salvation. Atlantropa would create jobs. It would create farmland. It would create new cities, new railroads, new ports, and new industries. It would give Europe cheap power and room to expand. And because the project would take over a century to complete, it would force nations to work together for generations. A German worker, a French engineer, an Italian planner, and a Spanish builder would all be part of the same mission. Sörgel believed that if Europe depended on the same dams, the same power grid, and the same shared infrastructure, war would become impossible. Because destroying your neighbour would mean destroying yourself. It was peace through engineering, peace through concrete, peace through turbines. But behind this futuristic dream was something much darker. When Sörgel talked about joining Europe and Africa, he was not imagining an equal partnership. Atlantropa was deeply Eurocentric. Africa was treated less like a continent full of people, cultures, and nations, and more like empty space waiting to be redesigned by European engineers. The Sahara would be transformed. The Congo Basin would be dammed into giant artificial lakes. New irrigation systems would supposedly turn deserts into farmland. European settlers would move south, and Africa would be pulled into a new order designed from Europe. That is one of the disturbing parts of Atlantropa. It was marketed as peaceful. It was marketed as scientific. It was marketed as the future. But it still carried the old colonial belief that Europe had the right to redesign other people's land for its own survival. Sörgel wanted to prevent war in Europe, but his answer was to project European power onto an even larger scale. And then there was the environmental cost. Today, it is obvious that partially draining the Mediterranean would be catastrophic. The Mediterranean is not just empty blue space on a map. It is an entire living system. Lowering it by hundreds of feet would destroy coastlines, wetlands, fisheries, ports, and ecosystems. The water left behind would become saltier and saltier. Marine life would collapse. Ancient harbour cities would be cut off from the sea. Venice, one of the most famous cities on Earth, would need special engineering just to survive. And the new exposed land would not instantly become paradise. Much of it could become salt flats, mud, and dead seabed. But in the 1920s and 1930s, many futurists did not think about nature the way we do now. To them, nature was not something to protect. Nature was something to conquer. Mountains could be cut. Rivers could be redirected. Deserts could be irrigated. Seas could be lowered. The world was raw material, and the engineer was the new emperor. For years, Sörgel promoted Atlantropa. He wrote books. He made maps. He gave lectures. He founded an institute. He tried to convince governments, engineers, and the public that this was not madness. And strangely, people listened. Newspapers reported on it. Architects drew futuristic designs. Engineers debated whether parts of it could actually work. Because the terrifying thing about Atlantropa is not that every part of it was impossible. The terrifying thing is that parts of the logic made sense. Yes, the Mediterranean loses huge amounts of water to evaporation. Yes, Gibraltar is a natural choke point. Yes, a difference in sea level could generate hydropower. Yes, giant dams can transform economies. The basic physics were not fantasy, but the scale was almost beyond comprehension. The Gibraltar Dam alone would have been one of the greatest engineering challenges in human history. And then came the politics. Spain, Morocco, Italy, Greece, Egypt, Turkey, France, Britain, North Africa, shipping companies, naval powers, colonial governments. Every country touching the Mediterranean would be affected. Every port, every fishing village, every trade route, every coastline. Atlantropa required the world to agree to redraw one of the most important bodies of water on Earth. And the world could barely agree on anything. Then history moved faster than Sörgel's dream. The Nazis rose to power in Germany. But Atlantropa did not fit neatly into Hitler's vision. The Nazi regime was focused eastward, toward conquest in Europe and the Soviet Union, not southward into a technocratic union with Africa. Then World War II came. Europe was destroyed again. And after the war, the world entered the atomic age. Suddenly, nuclear power became the new dream of unlimited energy. Why spend 150 years draining a sea when the atom promised power from a reactor? Atlantropa started to feel like a relic from another world. Sörgel kept pushing the idea until the end of his life, but in 1952, he died after being hit by a car. The project lost its main profit. A few years later, the Atlantropa Institute faded away. By 1960, the dream was dead. No dam was built. No sea was drained. No new continent rose from the Mediterranean. Atlantropa remained where it had always been strongest, on paper. But Atlantropa still matters, not because it almost happened, but because of what it reveals about human ambition. It shows how easily a civilization in crisis can fall in love with a giant solution. When people are afraid, they do not just want policies, they want visions. They want someone to point at the horizon and say, "There, that is the future." Sörgel looked at unemployment, energy shortages, political chaos, and the fear of war, and he answered with one of the largest construction projects ever imagined. It was absurd. It was brilliant. It was horrifying. It was futuristic. It was insane. And it was deeply human. Because Atlantropa is what happens when engineering stops being a tool and becomes a religion. When concrete becomes destiny. When a map stops being a record of the world and becomes a challenge. Imagine standing at Gibraltar in Sörgel's future. Behind you, the Atlantic Ocean crashes against a wall of concrete. In front of you, the Mediterranean sits hundreds of feet lower than it once did. Far below, turbines roar like thunder. Old coastlines are gone. New land stretches where the sea used to be. Rail lines cross between Europe and Africa. Cities rise on land that no human had ever walked on before. The world has been remade. And the question is not whether humanity could dream that big. The question is whether we should. This was Atlantropa, the plan to dam the Mediterranean, drain the sea, and build a new world from the ruins of the old one.